First of all, I'd like to thank the Havens Wright Center and Department of Sociology for hosting this lecture. And I'll plunge right in immediately to the book, because I think that's the best thing to do. So this book is really about development studies. So those people who are interested in the sociology or the political economy of development, which are linked, in my view, would have the most interest in the central argument of this book. So, of course, the question of development is one that has been debated over a very long period of time, and one that has been examined and put forth by scholars continuously over the last 78 years since the end of the Second World War, and particularly in the United States, as it began to compete with the Soviet Union and then to some extent China on developing countries of the global South. So by definition, development actually is an imperialist idea, because in the sense that it is something that Western countries seek to do to transform the economies, to transform the lives and the work that people that make up the vast majority of the population on the planet are engaged in. So the idea would be, for instance, to make Nigeria into another United States, with transport networks, infrastructure, industrial facilities, a huge service sector, a completely transformed economy, when Nigeria really is one of the poor countries of the world. I don't have the specific GDP per capita, but I think I'm safe to say it's about 2,000 to 3,000 a year GDP, and that's actually on the higher level of global South countries. So, notwithstanding the fact that this would and pose a significant problem for the future of the planet in terms of pollution and so forth and global climate change, this model is one that is applied and has been applied through the imposition of capitalist market economy norms by the United States and other Western countries, especially Western Europe, as well as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And so by saying this, I just give you a little history. Immediately after the Second World War, the President Harry Truman of the United States, one of his big initiatives was to initiate a development program for the global South. Isn't that a good idea? It'll really get the U.S. population enthused and so forth. In fact, one of his State of the Union speech, I believe in 1947, was about development and developing the world. Behind that is really a global competition that the United States was interested in, because they wanted to solidify their imperialist control over the world. So let me just say a bit about imperialism, because I think that's the subject matter of this book as well, and one that might be more contentious. So I also consider imperialism to be a significant body of a corpus of work that goes, one can go back to antiquity to see examples of imperialism in different contexts. But I use imperialism in the capitalist context since the last 500 years or so. But I guess capitalism starts 250 years or so. But when countries began to explore, so-called explore other regions of the world through Europe, the ecumene of the world, and in that sense, I also, to a great degree, share a perspective with world systems. So I think there is a relationship between this book and world systems theory, in the sense, although there are disagreements, and I can get into them, in the sense that I do believe that the center of economic power is in the West, and it has expanded from there, and that social struggles within that process occur where labor is the most exploitable and disposable as well in the case of migration. So exploitable in the Marxist sense. Okay, so there may be differences of opinion in this, but I'm using strict Marxism. The extraction of surplus value and the realization of value at the market. And so in this context, I do employ works of super exploitation in terms of the ways in which workers are exploited. And so there's a whole literature that actually emerged at the same time at the end of the Second World War that was advanced by historians, sociologists, political scientists to some degree. And that literature, transcends the political spectrum. So this book examines the early application of development by W.W. Rostow and his idea of the 5 stages of growth, which most of you are aware of. I don't have to get into that. I don't believe that those 5 stages of growth are highly related to emulating the not just Western, but the American imperial experience, or the American experience of capitalist development. And one of the major norms or constructs is that one has to free, one being the country has to free itself completely from any kind of state intervention whatsoever. The state must become a subordinate to capitalism as a whole. And that it also implies, following the work of Hayek and other Friedman, et cetera, it implies that every single person is a capitalist, that we as human beings are capitalists that are engaged in not just work, but we ourselves are investors. And we see this in the literature and also the policy statements over the last, I guess, about 10 or 20 years ago, and it continues to this day. So the idea of having an economy that's based on social exchange and so forth, which really it isn't. The idea, for instance, the gig economy, platform economy is based on many of these ideas of sharing, the sharing economy. These are very nice words that are going to pique the interest of a lot of people. And yet, at the same time, I would argue that it's a charade to a large extent, because the sharing economy is not, in my research, not just with this book, but many others, it is really one of extreme exploitation through the extraction of not just surplus value, but rent from labor, directly from labor, renting various products and so forth. So imperialism also, I'm just going to go to the other direction, but the part that I'm more interested in and have always been interested in is one that has a prodigious history from the Marxist perspective, and one that had been extremely popular over a very long, since the Second World War at the very least, but at least since Lenin, certainly. There were debates about imperialism even before Lenin, Hobson, et cetera. Many borrowed different ideas from others. There were, ideas of ultra-imperialism and so forth. I will say that I still think Lenin is mostly correct in the sense that finance capital is a primary force in the extraction of surplus labor from poorer countries and the realization of profits, accumulation and profits from global South countries, third world countries, countries that are under the thumb of imperialism, whatever you would like to call it. And so what I have employed in this book is more modern theorists. I don't get into Lenin to a great degree. I'll explain his work. I think everyone here should know his work. And yet, I do examine the theorists that emerged in the 50s and 60s. People such as Samir Amin, who had written extremely important works on imperialism, both economic, primarily within the mode of production and how modes of production have shifted and how the capitalist mode of production became the dominant one after the end of feudalism in the West, and how it displaced other modes of production that were actually functioning in many ways well. So, for instance, in South Asia, East Asia, and so forth. So his work on equal development is a very important influence on imperialist studies. And I can talk a lot about Samir Amin as I knew him. And also his work is appropriated by people who don't necessarily agree, and he certainly would not agree with his perspective. And that makes me think about, what do people say after people die? They completely distort. I can mention names, but I won't. They turned into a kind of a notion of the BRICS being an imperialist force in society. And okay, I'll say Patrick Bond, the sociologist in South Africa, and he would agree to that. So, but he wouldn't agree with me about Amin. And another very important writer, which I think had been sort of ignored for the better part of the last 30 years or so, and that is Argiri Immanuel, who, along with Samir Amin, they knew each other and so forth, were really working alone amongst a few other scholars like Elis Stavrianos and others. By working alone, I'm implying the fact that they were not working, they were all in Paris at the same time, and they weren't engaging them at all. And much of Immanuel's work is actually unpublished. Well, I'm trying to bring it to light, but it's completely unpublished. His most important book is called Unequal Exchange. It's become extremely popular on college campuses, amongst activists, amongst Marxists who recognize that there is a significant problem on the global level, and that Immanuel has a way of understanding it in the context of trade. And it is, he was a political economist. He was also very careful in his writing over a period of time of his life, which extends very long from the Greek resistance to working with Lumumba, to debating other scholars on the question of imperialism and so forth. He lived a long and rich life, and one that was isolated to some degree. He wasn't even allowed to speak at certain conferences in that sense. But at the same time, I would say circa around 1970, 80, his work, 80, 90, his work is forgotten. Toward the end of his life, he died in 2001. And the same could be said to a certain degree with respect to Samir Amin and other Marxists who worked in the West, who were, in Paris and other locations. And, Walter Rodney, too, would be an example of a person who has just come to life in the last 10, 15 years. One can mention many other scholars, and they all have the same perspective. Rodney makes a very clear case about social class, and that there are class differences that we must recognize that exist not just within the global North, and this is the more controversial part of Immanuel's work. And I'll give you examples as to why his work is important, because a lot of research has been done around it recently. That he believed very strongly that there was a class divide between the North and the South, so that the top 10%, 15% of the population were beneficiaries of the wealth that was accumulated through the exploitation of the global South, through the exploitation of labor and the exploitation of natural resources, et cetera. But I want to focus on labor because I think it's important to do so. As critics might say, well, these countries weren't using those natural resources anyway. How would they know how to, put them, monetize them in any way? And so I would argue that actually you need people to actually extract minerals from the ground, and you need people to grow cash crops and so forth, following the work of Zapaneg, who focuses on agriculture to a great degree, as well as a number of other important writers. Actually, it was Prabhat Patnaik and Utsa Patnaik, or Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik, who wrote a book on imperialism in, I'm going to say 2019, 2020. And they say all of a sudden imperialism is back, that we really need to take into consideration imperialism because it is the most significant phenomenon to understand capitalism. And that it's significant because it is rooted within nation states, capitalists within nation states. Of course, there are international capitalists as well, but it's capitalists within nation states that are beneficiaries. So when the Swiss decide to engage in the extraction of platinum in South Africa, it's the Swiss company that is chartered by the Swiss state. They have headquarters in Switzerland, and so forth and so on. The same thing could be said for Nestle's and many other companies around the world. They actually have names and they actually exist and inhabit countries, these nations. And the profits actually inure to those countries. They are very clearly invested in the banks of the West, the profits. So even if you have trade that goes on between Southern countries, one example, Maruti Suzuki. Suzuki is a Japanese, as many of you know, Japanese, you probably know them as a motorcycle company or a cycle company, but actually most of their production is automobiles in India. And actually India created a company called Maruti. Actually, it was established by the government and was thought to be kind of an iconic example of how India would develop. It never really got off the ground until Suzuki came in with their technology and so forth, and invested in the company. The Gandhi family actually owned a large share of that. So that's an interesting notion about capitalism in a certain way. But I think most of their shares were given away, and the company became a largely Japanese firm under the name of an Indian company. The people who buy Maruti Suzuki cars, which I think are pretty good cars, to tell you the truth, they're not sold in the United States or most countries of the West. They're mostly sold in India. They're sold in South Asia. They're sold maybe in Africa and places like that. And so you accumulate profits, and where do those profits go to? They go to Japanese banks, they go to US banks, they go to London, finance city of London, and so forth and so on, Wall Street. So even if there's trade that goes on in the South, and there's an extraction of surplus value in the global South, there's no real benefit to the North, the profits that are realized in the North. So anyway, I also look at migration, which is something that many of you know. I recognize a lot of people who are on the screen, who are here. So hi, everybody. I would say that to a great extent, migration, so this is a broad statement, bold statement, however you want to put it. I think migration is the major dynamic of labor today, a major dynamic of the constitution of labor today. Not just international migration, but internal migration as well. So if we're thinking about labor organizing, we have to organize migrant workers. That's even true today in the United States to a great degree. And, migrant workers want to be organized, but there are very few. Some of you here, I know, do research on that subject, but unions are weak in the United States. But on a global basis, in some places, there just aren't unions. And migrants, the difference between migration in the United States and many other parts of the world is that migration is temporary. And, for instance, in the United States, during the 1990s to about 2005, there were about 14 million migrants from Latin America that came to the United States, 13 to 15 million, I'd say. There was a huge drive to organize them in the United States amongst trade unions. And there might be some success stories amongst alts or independent unions, but for the most part, I know some of you might disagree, but most migrants are not in unions. Most Americans are not in unions either. I'm in a certain degree speaking to some of the people here who are here. So, when examining migration, I'm looking at the notion that if you can extract surplus value in the global South in various ways, it's crucial to, as populations change, it's crucial to also extract that surplus value in the rich countries of the world. And those rich countries are destination states, and they benefit greatly as a consequence of migration. In some respects, this book it is not necessarily one that is optimistic about the future, in the sense that in order to change the calculus, migrants do need to be in trade unions. They do need to be able to organize themselves. I'll say that in some countries that's taking place internally, like China, and in other places, there's just no unions, like Thailand. The unions barely even exist. So going back to the theoretical perspective, Immanuel, but Immanuel in this book, I cite him. He puts forward the argument that the only way to transform the calculus to improve the conditions of workers, and we're looking at workers in the 1960s, is for everybody in the global South, most of the population of the world, to move to the global North. That's the way to resolve the problem, because that would equalize wages in some ways. So I'm alluding to a particular fact or perspective that I think anyone who's a migrant is better off than those people who are not migrating. And even if they're poor, for the most part. So, there are no absolutes in life, and you can always examine, or in the world, you could always provide examples where that's not true. And certainly there are migrants who are highly exploited, and especially in this country. And so I put that forward significantly. So now to the second set of arguments, fast forwarding it, over the last 30 years or so, around 1995, I guess one could probably say around the time NAFTA was passed in the United States, but there were other agreements that came to fruition, the Schengen zone, et cetera. But over the last 30 years or so, the idea of migration has become the major source of development. So before that, there was official development aid, and then there were financial loans that were guaranteed by Western banks, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so forth. And of course, most of those countries defaulted in one way or another and had to receive structural adjustment bailouts, which sort of, well, we all know, had undermined the economies of these countries because, especially the working classes and poor of these countries, because they had to eliminate social programs such as education, housing, healthcare, even sanitation, and reduce the value of their currencies, engage in very tight fiscal policies as well as monetary policies, as I just said, make their currencies just fluid so that you can't protect your economy in any way whatsoever, which, by the way, was Hajun
Cheng.
Yeah, Hun Cheng makes the argument that actually Britain developed as a consequence of protectionism. So no protectionism for the developing world whatsoever. So that's one of the contradictions. Thank you. That's one of the contradictions that, the countries that are developed in capitalists and want to see free markets, at the same time, they did not develop in that way. They developed through excluding other countries from trade. Ricardo and his work is still applied by economists. It is important, very important to take into consideration. But at the same time, he didn't take into consideration a lot of these political factors that are in place, and that is that countries have a very difficult time to protect their economies, and we see examples. It's drawn from the crisis of 1997, 1998 in Southeast Asia, as well as East Asia, where countries' value of their currency plummeted overnight. We see this even before that with respect to the countries of the former Soviet Union, where their currencies are completely worthless in some respects. The ruble became worth less than a penny. Because of these ideas of development and your social services are no good, you need to kind of develop a Western model of social welfare. So these socialist states, or putative social states, if you want to say that, I would say socialist states, their economies were completely decimated, but also states that were trying to follow the capitalist roads and had some social welfare programs. They were also eviscerated by the fact that they had to engage in floating their currencies on world markets, which today even is a very serious problem as the dollar increases in value through monetary policies that are tightening monetary policies. It's really destroying the global South. I mean, I could remember, the beer in can as well, 10 years ago, the Indian rupee was worth, on a good day, 60 rupees to a dollar. Today it's about 100.
Go further, it was like 8.
Yeah, I'm talking about 10 years ago. What year was that?
It's like 1983.
It's just, yeah. So just to give an example, that's before neoliberalism was applied in India in 1990, right? Yeah. 8. So now it becomes 100. And they have actually agreed to most of the neoliberal policies. So what is the answer again? Migration is the answer. It is not necessarily a personal choice in most instances. It is the development policy that is being pushed by the United States and other capitalist states of the West, and used as the model to develop your society. So they've given up on lending money. Of course, they'll bail those countries out at high usury rates, high rates of loans and so forth. They've sort of given up on that, and they're saying, well, you can develop through the remittances programs because you can make a lot more money in the West. Again, going back to an equal exchange. Even migrants can make more money in the West than they can in their countries of origin. And so that's what's happened over the last 30 years. And today, the amount of remittances that are traded are about 1 trillion a year, and growing as the West has greater demands, West, North, for low-wage labor, and as the West requires labor to fill industries that there's no labor to engage in. And so I'm referring to destination states. It's not just the West, of course. It's countries like the Arab Gulf region or the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's Malaysia, a few other countries, and it's even countries like South Africa to some degree. But I don't want to focus on that to any great sense because it's a poor country in many respects, a divided hybrid poor country where the majority live very poorly, and there's high level of migration internally and to South Africa. So this becomes a model. So the purpose of the main point of this book is that this isn't working. So the book contradicts the mainstream political economists or economists at the World Bank, at the IMF, the World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, et cetera, all the financial firms on Wall Street, the City of London, Tokyo, et cetera, that this is just not going to be the way in which countries are going to develop, in my view. That's not only based on a prognostication, but on the evidence that I've found in many countries throughout the world, which I have increasingly gone to because I feel that's where I've always done this. I'm mostly interested in those people who are the least well off. And, I focus, some of you know I focus on the United States too, but I've shifted that focus to Global South. And, migrant workers, as well as their families, are not doing better as a consequence of the mobility that they are taking. There's a sense in which development becomes warped, and actually there is no development to any great extent. Now, I use the term great extent because I'm supposed to. I could make a much sharper argument, but I think this argument is sharp enough. I might even argue that there's no development at all taking place, except families might benefit as a consequence of migration. You might be able to educate a member of your family and so forth. The numbers of migrants internationally are about 200 million, which is a very large number. I really tip my hat to the International Organization of Migration, which is a unit of the of the UN, one of their agencies, but even they are supporting this policy as a means to develop. And I think that's wrong. I think it doesn't reflect the reality of the situation. And in the sense that we have not found any example of a country that has actually developed as a consequence of migration, unless they're the receiving countries. So the dichotomy is between those countries that are origin states, which are poorer, although some migration scholars would say origin states are richer, and I can make that case as well. If I had a chart, I could do that. But I don't need the chart to actually explain it. So of that $1 trillion, most of the remittances are sent by rich countries to other rich countries or high wage countries, middle to high wage countries. So low wage laborers do not necessarily, first of all, they don't have as much money. The numbers are huge. They don't make up, I mean, they make up a fraction of that 200 million, the rich make up, or high skilled make up a fraction of the 200 million low wage workers, temporary laborers, which we can get into as well. And they send money home. So if I'm speaking to a Western audience, we've seen a migration that has now expanded in the last 5 years, although there's been extreme levels of border control, as we all know, that has terrorized these populations that ironically have been migrating because in many cases of U.S. sanctions or U.S. intervention in one way or another. So Venezuela would be an example. In New York City and New York State, very large share of the migrants are Venezuelans who are working class Venezuelans. And even in the liberal New York City, there is some absolute pushback by the political and economic elites of the city that, why are we having these migrants? The business people are saying, well, these migrants should be put to work, which will probably happen in the end and is to some degree through temporary programs already occurring. So they're using it as a form of a drain on the economy of the West. And I would argue that's not the case. It actually regenerates economies over many years. Undocumented migrants actually typically stay permanently, although under very severe conditions, because it's very difficult or it's impossible today, in most instances, to gain status unless you marry somebody or get a company to sponsor you. And in most instances, if you have a company to sponsor you, you will be a member of the high income or highly skilled workers. So those highly skilled workers typically come from the global South. They come from countries that have training institutes, high-level training institutes. In India, they're called Indian Institutes of Technology, maybe 20 to 25 of them throughout the country, maybe more, maybe less, but I'm just giving a figure. And these workers represent the elite of society. So it's not just because they're smarter, it's also that they come from socioeconomic backgrounds, I'll just put it that way, that are privileged. So I'll use the term privilege in that context. And so they're able to come to the United States for a period of time, and 3 years that would be under the visa that permits them to come to the United States. So I think it's called an H-2-1 visa. And they come to the United States and they live here for 3 years and work here for 3 years. They don't make as much as the typical worker, and I'm referring to workers in the STEM industries, STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And in most instances, they're able to actually establish residence in this country. But even if they don't, they can go back to their home country, and it's not just India, and have a very nice lifestyle. What a working class wage in the United States and India is a rich person in many instances. When you're making, I mean, yeah, I've spent a lot of time in India. You're making something like, well, it depends on who you are. Okay, I'll just say this: 94% of the population is precarious labor, and they work very hard, and they go from job to job. Some of those precarious laborers work consistently in one location, in a factory or something like that, or somebody's home, or in the subway systems or metro systems of the countries, and make a very small amounts of money to even survive. They can't survive, in fact. They require some kind of family member to contribute. So you have extended families living in homes and so forth that are very cramped. And so 94% of the population is living precariously. 6% has full-time labor at wages that are not high, but higher than those workers. So, okay, so what's the differential? The differential would be between, and this is, I'm using US dollars, between $50 to $100 a month and $300 to $500 a month. On an international level, you're not going to get paid more than $500. That's been the norm, and that's actually becoming too high now for international capitalists. So, these people who migrate to the United States can live on a working class salary of, I don't know what it is. I can say 50,000, but if you live in New York, it's got to be higher because of the cost of living. But I think all throughout the United States it's pretty expensive. They do very well. They have servants, or they're able to establish their own businesses. Actually, some of them have created corporations that are very well known. Withrow would be just one example, and they are in 3 or 4 different major cities. These cities have grown exponentially, taking over the agrarian lands that surround them. Cities such as Bangalore, Mumbai, as well as Hyderabad and to some degree Delhi. And they are displacing workers in their home countries who are then migrants because they have to move, and internal migrants in that sense. But in India, most of Indian migrants are not highly skilled migrants. Most Indian migrants are low-wage migrants who are working in agriculture, construction, manufacturing, home care services, as well as the platform economy. Increasingly, the literature on the platform economy is blossoming over the last 5 years even. It's not very long, and expanding dramatically. So I think that's a very important distinction to make between within countries. There's also classes that exist, and I would consider India to be a country that is, even though they have a GDP per capita of around 2,500, they have a very large economy, and they are able to, I don't think they're a comprador country. I think they actually have their own economy and probably could survive on their own to some degree. They don't need to be part of the international order. They're big enough to do so. If they wanted to have a autochthonous or internal autarkic development, I think they can do that and probably do well, better than they're doing today. And they don't need the international capital to come in and develop their economies necessarily. What they do need is a redistribution of wealth, and that has not taken place. This book, focuses on origin countries and destination countries. And the origin countries are, for the most part, poor. I made the comment before that most of the remittances are transmitted and I want to reinforce it, are transmitted by people who are wealthy or middle class. However, absolutely most migrants are not in that category, and their families are absolutely not in that category. So, 70 to 80% of the migrants might be low-wage migrants, temporary migrants, or undocumented migrants. And I can get into the specifics of the various three corridors of migration. One would be the US, North American one from Latin America. The second would be one that has changed dramatically, the European migrant system, incorporating the Schengen zone, which is very disturbing as we almost on a weekly or bi-weekly basis read about hundreds, thousands of people dying in ships trying to traverse the Mediterranean from Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, etc., to Europe, Italy, etc., Greece. So that's the point I want to make. So a country that I have looked at, gone to many of these countries, so in Nepal, where the standard of living has not really expanded whatsoever. The city is essentially the city in Kathmandu. It's maybe the main city of Nepal, which has a population of about 40 million people, which might surprise people. So what is the population of Canada? 35, 40 million? Just to give you kind of a sense of things, far smaller in landmass, and that landmass is dominated by mountains. So the agrarian areas are very densely populated. And there is a huge divide in terms of the indigenous population and the population that is not indigenous. And so they have migrant workers who typically come from agrarian regions, and they are sent to other countries. And one of the reasons why development doesn't take place is these are usually the youth and women to a large extent who leave the country for destinations elsewhere, typically in the global south, but also in places like Britain, now that they're outside of the Schengen zone and the EU. And they are highly exploited. And this came to the fore, especially during the pandemic, when we saw so many examples of wage theft in the billions of dollars between 2020 and 2022 or so, tens of billions of dollars of wage theft. Primarily women lost their money because they were sent home quickly and did not retrieve that money. There are no lawyers, or even if you have lawyers, there are not enough lawyers, and so forth. And so what I'm saying is that it's not something you can really count on for a long period of time. We had the 2008-09 financial crisis in the midst of this rise of remittances, this rise of migration. And it reduced the number of remittances, and countries declined and were not able to accept an equivalent number of remittances of migrants. And so it keeps shifting. So not in the Nepalese migrants through bilateral agreements. There is no international agreement on migration that is enforced. There is the Global Compact on Migration, but it's not enforced. The United States, Trump said absolutely not. It violates our sovereignty, quote unquote. But other countries of Europe especially have done the same. So there may be a compact on migration which stipulates specific rights, wages, treatment, hospitality, and on, protection. It's a name only, really. So I'd love to go into what's happened in the origin states to a greater degree. My time is limited. And I just want to say very briefly about the destination countries that we're talking about destination countries like the United States, all of Europe, parts of Northeastern Europe, Asia, Northeastern Asia, as well as part of the global South like Malaysia, the Arab Gulf region, maybe one or two other places, but not many others, in which there are very large percentages of migrants. So in a country like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, you have a total population of about 13 to 15 million people, of which about 13 million people are actually migrants and have no rights to citizenship, not even a path to citizenship. That's actually true of all Gulf states. There's no path to citizenship. The treatment is abhorrent. But, one can say the same thing for global North countries as well. People remember Postville, Iowa, in this region, actually, not too long ago. And about 15 years ago, if I remember correctly, maybe 18, where migrants were forced out of a meatpacking factory from Mexico. They were arrested by ICE, the enforcement agency of the migration system in this country, and deported, arrested and deported. So the story is very negative, and here I'm talking about industrial workers, and yet at the same time, there will be a tremendous need for migrants in the years to come as the populations of the North decline and stabilize, and there's a greater need for labor. So the laborers of the world, or the workers of the world, are going to be migrant workers to a great degree. Of course, many people have different interpretations of worker. And from my perspective, that would be the case. And so the book goes into the question of border control, which I mentioned briefly. So how do you ameliorate this problem? I'll mention briefly in my 1 or 2 minutes left. And that, of course, I don't have all the answers, and no one does. But I would, and I made this case before, I would argue that to a great extent, there is a need for degrowth in the global North. That means that not just the very wealthy in this country, but certainly in these countries, the rich countries, but also ordinary people will have to accept less. The consumerism has to stop to some degree. And that's one way to maybe the only way to develop the global South. And I think they must develop their own models of development. They should not be on the basis of these failed marketized models in which every migrant is a capitalist themselves. I can go into a lot more detail, but I want to finish on time, and I'm on time. I look forward to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation, and since we've been discussing this, I sort of wanted to put on the table certain kind of basic issues that you've addressed, and sort of just a clarification, just sort of to get things going. So I think at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned development as a kind of imperialist idea.
Yeah,
and I think that if you could sort of unpack that a little bit, it would be helpful, because one of the arguments that you were making later on was the way in which migration actually hinders development.
Yeah.
But I think what you're doing is you're working with very different concepts of development throughout your talk. Because there seems to be one place where development itself is part of imperialism, or the idea of development is imperialism. But there's another sense in which, in that sense, to the extent that you're developing a critique of imperialism, development is not a good. But in the later part of your talk, it seems like development is a good that migration is actually hindering. And so I think that's something you want to unpack. And I think towards the end, you were saying, yes, what we need are new ideas of development and so on. And so, right. So it could be that you were already bringing that into your analysis.
Well, I'm dealing with a brilliant philosopher here. That's a great question. And I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. And I actually think you're correct in that question. And it's not something that's part of this book. But you're right in the sense that on the one hand, what the focus of this book is, there's a whole field of development studies, like I said, that transcends disciplines. And I'm critiquing development, capitalist development as a whole, and I'm critiquing migration as a form of development. But yet, at the same time, I'm arguing for a form of development. And so I think maybe this answers your question, but it may not. I think it requires a very long discussion. Okay, so why does migration hinder development, which is a goal, right? The capitalist development to develop a society. Well, I guess if you're going to use a Marxist framework, the society has to become an advanced capitalist society, or a capitalist society that where everyone has enough to survive on, and so forth. And that is a Marxist perspective, that capitalism precedes socialism in a fundamental way. So I'm trying to square this with your very important point. And so that we have had 78 years of development studies or thinking, and that so I am arguing for a kind of a shift, and I'm not the only one that's doing that. There's a whole number of many scholars throughout the world that are doing this, and that shift has to be one in which countries decide the path they go, and it may not be a capitalist form of development. It may be a different form of development in which there is popular control, to use a neutral word, over the society that guarantees people the basic necessities of life. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
that's good.
Trying to.
Okay. So I guess I feel like, first of all, I think development as a concept starts before World War II, because there was this sort of civilizing mission of the early 20th century, which is very parallel.
Yeah.
But what happens after World War II is that the US starts talking about development. And it's very much related to America's expansion into markets around the world and the rise of multinational corporations. So I guess one of the things that I was thinking about in the shift in the 80s and 90s is it's really about the way multinational corporations begin to rewrite global trade rules, and particularly push for the reconstruction of the Uruguay round and then the WTO,
Absolutely.
totally dominated by American corporate interests, which undermines the existence of states everywhere. And so one of the things that you would have to do the development that you're talking about is to rethink what it means to have a state, especially in poor countries. But it also raises the issue of nationalism in the richer countries. And so I wanted to ask about something that I've seen even in South Africa, where lefty unions become incredibly nationalist and xenophobic, because and I kept thinking that the one theorist you didn't mention was W.A. Lewis.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's right.
And the surplus of, development in the context of abundant supplies of labor. So we have that on a global scale now.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
We are seeing more and more unions act like labor aristocracies and using national boundaries as a way to assert those interests. You were seeing this in Germany right now with this new coalition.
Yeah.
We're seeing in South Africa. How do you address the risk of promoting a nation-based development process is that you block poor people out of this opportunity. So what do you do about that?
Oh, okay. That's a very big question.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Answer for it, but
Just had to rant.
okay, so the country I know better, South Africa, apparently you know it fairly well. I tried to avoid it to some degree because South Africa is a poor country, is a hybrid country, and most of its population is living under poverty conditions, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And that excludes the migrants who are there. And that creates a lot of populism in the country to a great degree. So there's been a lot of thinking on that topic, right? And you're probably familiar with it. And of course, yes, the idea of development is something that's always been the case under capitalism. How do you develop a society? It did refer a little bit back to the British model, and there have been other models, obviously Korea. But so the point, and you also raised a question, which I don't know if I did, aristocracy of labor.
I did.
Okay, it's fundamental to this book in some ways, and that's ouch. That's something that is hard to swallow for a lot of people, right? It's a bitter medicine for many people in the West. And I actually agree with that perspective, where I think it's a valid, it must be re-theorized and advanced in our contemporary period. There was a specific time in which it was, and there has been this very minute renaissance in the last 5-10 years. Zach Cope has done this, and amongst others, have written about this aristocracy of labor. Torkel Lawson, I don't know if you know his work, and even Jason Hipkel to some degree. He actually buys into this. He's not a Marxist, but so yeah. So and I don't know if I'm going to answer your question. So let me know if I don't. There's been increasingly discussions about multipolarity. And I don't think South Africa, I love South Africa and I care about the people. And I make this point. I mean, Cecil Rhodes was able to create a Southern African
empire
as a imperialist of the highest order. Why can't there be a Southern African region or state that's able to control its resources and strong enough to be held accountable by not just the 60 million people of South Africa, but the 250 to 300 million people of Southern Africa, Tanzania, 60 million, 67 million, Mozambique, and Angola. So, in terms of equity, which is the point you're making in terms of how do you distribute that and how do you ensure that you don't have state capture, those are very important questions that I mean, this book it's not in the remit of this book, but I think, okay, so I'll say, I think forms of socialism would be the answer. That's why I said we need to find new modes of development. And, so what is the idea of redistribution of income from the North to the South? It implies a form of socialism, especially if that redistribution mandates that is based on essential needs of populations. I made this point before. China, it's infuriating. People go after China all the time, but they have an internal market of about 200 to 300 million people who are middle or working class, let's say, working class. Yeah, at the same time, most of the production is for export. And so those factories are producing consumer goods, automobile parts, etc. Most of them in the world, well, a plurality, and they are sent to Europe and they're sent to North America. And so who are really the beneficiaries of that pollution? That's just kind of like a question that we need to ask. And and I would also add to that point that the Chinese working class is poor. It was something that some people have a misnomer that there's a wealthy Chinese working class. They're basically poor, but they have enough to survive on. And China was able to, as a somewhat autonomous country, was able to actually transcend poverty in the last 10 or 15 years, now 10 years. That may bother people, right? But they're large enough to be able to do that. And so is India. And so I would argue that Radhika Desai does this, as well as Paris Yaros and others have argued for creating states that are larger, and that there is not a global hegemon that exists. I actually think that's one way to, maybe the only way to save the planet, to tell you the truth. Because of the way the global economy is structured today. But you're asking such a big question.
I know, I'm sorry.
Subject to the class. I would love to take your class.
If I come up with any answers, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I want. No, you asked, and around the labor aristocracy theory of.
Well, I was thinking
course,
more about the way nationalist labor movements in richer countries and middle income countries are increasingly excluding migrants.
Absolutely.
Ways that I think we need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Because
I think we have a labor aristocracy in the United States. I think those people who are the most in opposition to migration may be the biggest beneficiaries of it. That, like I said, it's a bitter pill, right? So we look at all the migration literature now. It is arguing that the most important issue is populism and xenophobia amongst populations, of course, poor populations in global South countries like South Africa, but in Germany, come on, I mean, or the United States or Canada to a lesser extent. But I think there's a big difference between being xenophobic in South Africa, and some people would like to focus on that, some scholars, than being, they're all bad, they're all wrong, than being xenophobic in the United States when you're actually a real beneficiary. And of course, there's South African classes that are beneficiaries of migration, no question about it. So I don't like it.
And there are lots of South African employers who'd rather employ migrants because they have fewer rights, and they're very clear about it.
Yes. Yeah, I studied Malawian workers, and actually Malawi is one of the countries that is lauded by the World Bank as the success story. All right, it's a success story, 644 GDP per capita. And we don't even have to measure that. But I've been there, and it's an agrarian society that depends on subsistence agriculture. That's it, basically. And they have a long history of migration to South Africa. They've developed the mines. They were there in Kimberley in 1869 when diamond mines were open. And now that they're no longer working in the mines, they're working in biscuit factories and security firms. I mean, they're working as care workers, a lot of high levels of exploitation, construction, at a fraction of what South African Black South African workers make.
Thank you for that really generous set of questions. Okay, no, that was wonderful. Andy, next we have a question from Maxwell, who is joining us virtually. Maxwell writes, I've previously seen discourse on the greater mobility of capital compared to labor as a way to leverage power against labor. Do you see capital mobility, such as offshoring of jobs, as part of the same phenomena as migration, or do you see them as two different forces?
Yeah, that's been a longstanding issue with respect to capital mobility, and workers' movements have asked for labor mobility that is equivalent to, or at least even close to, capitalist mobility, or capital mobility, and that has not been achieved whatsoever. I mean, there have been a number of the people who argue for open borders. I don't go there in this book because I don't think it's part of the book, because it's a book about development. And I think that, so the question is that, just kind of like the question is that, is labor mobility a possibility, or
is capital mobility or capital mobility the same a part of the same phenomena as migration?
I think increasingly with respect to the kinds of official migration that's taking place increasingly, through temporary labor programs, bilateral agreements. But I also make the case that, I made this before, that the U.S. system, we can say, is a migration regime. The lack of a decent migration program, or lack of migration program, is a program. It's a program to exploit workers. And so I think that migrants should have rights to cross borders to work without impediments whatsoever. And they should be, you know, I support the Global Compact on migration that reflects SDG goals and also the treatment of workers in destination states, maybe with a path to citizenship, or some people don't want to be citizens, but they should have that path if they're going to be working for a period of time. Or I really think as long as they should have that path.
Wonderful. Thank you. The floor is open. If we have any other questions. Oh, yes, we do. Pete, please.
Good thought. So picking up on part of the discussion you're having with Gay, if the labor movement in the global north,
I have a unique name, I know.
I read all your books.
if the labor movement in the global north is acting increasingly or has always acted like a labor aristocracy, what's the upshot of that? Like, what's the takeaway, if you like? What is the consequence in terms of your argument that you would have with the labor movement in the global north in relation to how it should act? So that's one question. The second question is slightly different, and it's not really connected to the argument you're making in this book, but you mentioned it a couple of times in passing, which is the organizational form of new movements. You've mentioned, for example, some migrant workers are in unions, of course, but outside of union organizing, are there any innovations happening within the type of organizations that are happening? I mean, at the start of the 2000s, for example, there were various aspects of new institutional forms developed in, say, for example, Latin America, that seem to be innovative. Say, for example, the coordinadoras in defense of gas and water in Bolivia and so on. Now, these aren't exactly replicable models. They require, you're predicated on huge levels of existing organization, mobilization, and so on. But I'm just wondering if in the last decade or so, there are any new institutional forms that are developing in the global south that aren't necessarily being recognized by academics and scholars here.
With respect to migration?
With respect to migration, I'm particularly interested in migrant workers, but also perhaps precarious workers more broadly, but I'm thinking about in global south. So Janaína, for example, does fantastic work on Brazil in the homeless workers movement, which, for example, we're chatting to her, I didn't even know about, but yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think absolutely that. So I'll start with the second question first. Absolutely, there are forms. I think we're, going back to the work of Beverly Silver, 2003, she puts forward the whole argument about labor struggles, and labor struggles will take place where capital formation is at the most highest level, and where you can exploit labor at the highest rate. And I think she's right. I mean, she's absolutely right. But I just had a text message to her a few weeks ago, and we had this discussion over text, WhatsApp, and I said, you need the organization. Without the organization, it's nothing. I mean, but with having said that, there are a number of local organizations. In South Africa, it would be the Casual Workers Advice Office that has supported autonomous efforts to struggle alongside labor unions in many cases. NOMSA would be the example, National Union of Metal Workers, South Africa. And they've done a very good job in organizing workers, but I would say the workers are organizing themselves. At the same time, I think you need unions. And I don't think they're there. In many of the countries that I look at, Thailand would be an example, there are no unions. So the ILO has to fill in that gap. But of course, you have social movements that are doing important work. I'll even say CSOs, civil society organizations, are doing important work in some instances in protecting the rights of women. One cannot deny that. But what we're seeing is the ILO going beyond its charter. Of course, the ILO starts before the UN, and it's an agency of the UN, 1919. And so they're training non-responsive unions on how to recognize that migrant workers are valuable, they deserve rights. It helps, kind of the basics of labor organizing. And I think that's not their remit whatsoever. I mean, they're supposed to, they're a tripartite organization that represents state interests, capital interests, as well as worker interests. And so they're the ones that are representing worker interests because they're not there in many countries of the world, increasing the number of countries. And I think that's, it's a good thing that at least they're doing it, but it's not the proper mechanism. But of course, you mentioned Bolivia and a lot of Latin American movements, landless workers movements and so forth, as well as industrial workers throughout the world. They're engaged in struggle. I think we're at a period of time where there's a possibility of, I'm not going to say a new form of worker organization, because I said that, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. We're in an interregnum where there's a need for organization, but workers are still struggling inside and outside of organizations. So in South Africa, to give an example, I think they're called the Simba Workers Union. They're not an official union, but they're chartered, or they're put together by the Casual Workers Advice Office, which is actually one of the worker centers that actually is effective in mobilizing workers. But they're not interested in mobilizing them into organizations, except, maybe they can form their own organizations. That's a possibility. Yeah, and many of them are migrant workers too, but not all. Most of them are not, I don't think. So your first question, what should we do about the labor aristocracy?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question is more that I think you identify something, a real phenomenon, which is that the labor movement acts like this, but there is also a specific set of tactical reasons why they do so, because they're attempting to defend their members' interests. What would be your argument to the labor movement in the global north, given the fact that they are navigating this terrain?
Well, even Marx writes about the aristocracy of labor. I mean, he makes this very cute, his disappointment with the British trade unions and not defending the rights of Irish workers. And this picked up by Engels. There's a long history of socialist thinkers and theorists and so forth examining this phenomenon and being very disappointed. I mean, to some degree, Lenin doesn't, but he talks about the trade unions as not really being the vehicle because they're part of the labor aristocracy, the trade union leaders, and so forth. So this is a dominant theme. And so when I say bitter pill, I would say that the aristocracy of labor includes all workers in the West. That's the bitter pill. And I say that because even the undocumented migrant worker is better off than the precarious worker in the global South who can't find work and so forth. That's an argument. I think we need to develop that theorization, and I'd like to do some more work on that topic, but I don't have the answers to that question. Hobsbawm has written on it to some degree, but there really hasn't been a few writers, nothing really recent on the subject except for Zach Hope and Torkel Lawson, and a growing number of people who are favoring the global South. But so I think it's really ripe for investigation, my perspective.
Thank you, Manny. On that somber note, I am going to bring the session to a close, I'm afraid, unless you have any words of hope you want to share with us.
My words of hope is that, actually, I think I just mentioned it based on Pete's question, that workers are organizing.
Southern insurgency.
Workers organizing at a rate that's higher.
Changing some of these discussions.
So that's very positive, right? And we're in a interregnum where we don't know where, you need organizations to advance. You can't do it as individuals. And what this book basically says is that these individual migrants that go wherever are not advancing the cause of working class solidarity, especially because of the fact that they are chartered by the World Bank, the IMF, and the global financial institutions. That's their role, to become capitalists. They have individualistic perspectives. We can go a lot further on that, but it really is. But I want to be positive, so I think we're in a moment of historical change where there will be new unions that emerge that represent a lot of these workers, and they are emerging. I see them in many countries of the world.
A much better place to end. I would like to thank Immanuel Ness for joining us today, as well as the Department of Geography and the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center for helping us bring Immanuel to us today. So until later, take care. Thank you.